Any examples? Just cover up everything on the desktop. I'm not sure what's over there. We'll just hide it. Better safe than sorry. All right. So I'm going to talk. Oh, right. I'm going to talk a little bit about configuration management. I'll probably do maybe just a little high level. I know Nate covered a little bit about the config files in the overview of Backdrop this morning, but I wanted to talk about two different ways I personally manage config files in Git. One of the things that you can do with config files if you don't want to manage them in Git is manage them using Backdrop's user interface, which is what's built in. There's a way that you can do an export of an individual file. So if you make a change on a local site and need to deploy it, you can make a change on a local site, use this interface to pull out. This is what Nate did this morning. I don't know, some custom block content. Here we go, whatever your skills are. And you can deploy that to another site. You can also do an export of your entire site. So if you spend a whole week building content types and views and doing a whole bunch of different stuff, you can do your whole site at once. And if you do an export here, it'll deliver to you a tarball. And when you get onto your other site, let's see, this is Chrome. So this is actually my live site. You can then import using the same interface. So it gives you a way to do a single file or a whole lot of files. There's currently an issue to do collections of files, which would add something more like features where you can be like, here's a content type and a view packaged together. Here's what we're thinking about calling them recipes. And right now we can only do an individual file or entire site. We can't do a subset, but we want to be able to make it so that you can do subsets too through the user interface. I, however, only have one site where I manage config for the user interface, and it's a Pantheon site. And I'm doing a Pantheon site through the user interface because Pantheon makes it hard to manage your config in version control. You can't have a writable directory that's not your files directory. And so you have to put your config files in your files. And so because you're managing them as part of your files, it's easiest to just let them be treated like files and not have them in version control because your files is never in version control. But there are some workarounds with Pantheon where you can commit your staging directory and not your active directory, and it's fine. And I've done that at some sites there too. But one site I use UI. All the other sites I manage one of two ways. This is my personal site. I'm using an example because I am one person that maintains this site, and I have a very specific workflow about how I do it. And this is actually on this website. Tim reminded me that I wrote this blog post yesterday, and I'd forgotten that I'd written it before that. But it basically explains what my file system looks like, where the configuration files are in relation to the web root, which is usually outside but right next to it, and how I have two directories in there. Both of them are named active. So when you install Backdrop, you get one directory called active and one directory called staging, and that works great for a single site. But when you have multiple sites and you need to switch configuration between the two of them, what I end up doing is having a directory for each instance of the site. So this particular site, I have one copy on my laptop. I have one copy on a server. I don't have a beta site. I don't have a dev, a test. It's just two sites. It's not very complicated. I feel like I don't need all of the different layers. If I break it, that's fine. I'll figure it out and fix it. I'm the only one that cares, and usually I don't care, so it's fine. Low risk. So in this case, I have two directories. One of them is dev active. This is the directory that my local site, my dev site, is using as its active directory. The other directory, prod active, is the one that my production site is using as its active directory. The alternate ones are staging on each site. And so when I do a git pull, this is what I call the figure 8 method. I'll SSH into my live server and I'll do a git pull, and it'll pull the contents of the live dev active and prod active over. And because the site uses opposite ones for staging and directory, staging and active, it'll switch them. So I can make a change on production, pull, config sync, change on local, pull, config sync, and it just moves all of the files around exactly where they need to be. So this seems kind of crazy. I figured I'd do a demo so you can see what it's like. So here on my live site, I don't know, what should we change? Oh wait, I know, I just did an update, I think, to 113, 113.1. And I ran the updater, and I think, I'm just looking at this in another window. I don't think that's right. We're just gonna ignore those. Okay. Form cache expiration. Oh, right. I was testing something crazy. Date log format. Long date format, log date format. Oh, what did I do? Okay, so I'm gonna check in version control. This is my local site. Oh, you guys probably can't see this. Woo. Is that gonna be the same way on this window? Yeah, jeez. Ah. Okay. Okay, so I'm currently logged into my live server. You can see here I have my doc root directory right next to my config directory. I also happen to keep a patch file for every one of my sites, so if I'm running any patches, I can keep track of them. But we're going to go into config, and here you have dev active and live active. So on my production site, if I run a git status, you can see that there's one change to the live directory. And this is the addition of log date format. So in the latest update that I run on the live site, the update script changed a config value in this file. So this is pretty common where you'll deploy some changes, run configuration, and now your live site has configuration changes that aren't in version control. So I'm going to go ahead and add that file. I'm going to commit it. Hope there's nothing else in here. Good. Push it up. And so I made a change to the live active directory, and this is the one my live site is using as active. I go to my local site. If I do a pull, it should, we'll pull down more, but that's fine. It did pull down the change to the system core file, which is what I want. And so now on my local site, I can run to, this is my local site, maybe bigger here too. Configuration development, configuration management. So it's showing these same things are out of sync. So what happens when you don't pay attention to your site? Okay, so I turned off comments by default and added some settings. That's fine. And then in system core, we should see the new date, which is fine. And then what is this? Yeah, we'll see what happens. So I'm assuming that because this is coming from the live site, this is what I'm running on the live site, and this is actually what I want. When I run this synchronize, what's going to happen is going to copy all of the config files from the live directory, which my local site is using as staging, run whatever database changes are necessary, and then it'll copy them into the dev active directory. So here you go, import. All right, so now if I do a git status on my local environment, it'll show that the live directory is empty, because what it does when it does that config sync is empty out whatever your staging directory is. So I'm going to check that out because I don't care about that. And then I'm going to look at what's actually changed. So it's copied those 3 files from my live folder into my dev folder. So I'm going to add them. I'm going to call this config live to dev. Okay. Nothing new on live, I hope. This still shows as unchanged, which is good. Okay, so now if I change something else, I don't know, what did we change? Audience participation. Change something else in site information. How about a new slogan? Since I'm not getting any help, I'm going to do something very lame. I'm going to add USA to my slogan, because why not? I'm going to hit save. And saving this file, if I do a git status, it should show my dev active now shows that change. And so if I add my dev active, git pull, git push. Okay, then I can go to my live server, pull, and it should pull in that system core file. And the other ones that we just synced, which is totally fine because they were there anyway. And then here's the system core one. I need to add a color thing on this terminal window. That's fine. Okay, so now if I go back to core, it should show only the change in that one file. So this should show, oh geez, Oakland, California became Oakland, California, USA. It did also add some default values, which is essentially nothing for all of the site logo attributes, site favor icon information, whether it should be in my theme, if it's uploaded, if there's a path. So a bunch of nothing, essentially. That's okay. I'm fine with that. So I'm going to go ahead and close this, and I'm going to import here. And now what it'll do is it'll copy all of the files from my dev active directory into my live active directory. And so if I do a git status, it should show the dev active directory is now empty because it's deleted that. So I'm going to check that out. And then it should show my one change to the live file here. So it'll show the same things we just saw in the diff. So I'll add that. And if we go look at my site, Oakland, California, USA, should probably confirm that that worked on the local site anyway, but it did. So git pull, should be nothing, git push that back up, right? And then if I do a git pull on my local, it will pull in the change to live active, which should also show on my configuration page. No changes. So that's the figure 8 method. I find it's really fast if there's only one developer. As soon as you add more than one developer, it gets really confusing because you're like, wait, was it your dev active or was it my dev active? And then you start overriding each other and it gets really complicated. So when there's more than one developer, I usually have a live active directory in the same way that we had on a single developer. But instead of having a dev active that's in version control, I have a dev active that's ignored. And then I have a staging directory that's in version control. And this way, every one of the sites is running off of the same staging directory for staging and their own copy of the active directory for that site. So you can also have like a beta live active, a test live active, a dev, dev server live active, or however many sites you have, you can have individual folders that contain that code. In order to understand how to manage this, we've actually documented it because there's going to be a lot of people who are working on our community site. This is the forum site. And so the number one rule is when you're working locally, you never want to commit anything into the live active directory, which is the opposite of what I did a minute ago when it was just me managing. I would always commit into live. But when you're working with shared people in a shared environment and the live site running off of the live Active Directory, it's best to let Backdrop manage the contents of that directory. And everyone who's working on the site will make commits into the staging directory. And so it doesn't matter who's been working on the site. If I do a git pull, I'm going to pull in the latest of everything into the staging directory, and I'll be able to sync my local site with its local config directory to the staging directory. The only time this gets messy, and I've done this with Kevin a couple of times and accidentally overwritten his changes, is when somebody's trying to take the live site's current configuration and put that into staging. You have to be really careful when you're comparing the diffs of those files and make sure that there isn't one file that's changed in both places and that those changes are getting merged adequately. So I usually, in a perfect world, would not change the live site until after, like if you have a view, right? Don't change the view on live. If you're changing the view on your local site, only change it in one place, and then you won't run into that problem. So there's some step-by-step instructions here on how to set up your local site when you do a git pull. And for this repository, you'll actually get a settings.php file that contains the directory setup that's different. So there's information here about like, hey, you need to create a settings.php file on your local site that has it this way. And then there's some information about like when you're done, when you start working, make sure that your staging is in sync. And then when you're done, you also manually copy the contents of your dev act directory into staging. And then you manually review each of those config file changes to be like, yes, I did want to change this view. No, I didn't want to change the system core settings to disable CSS aggregation or whatever it is. There's always something in there where you're like, oh no, I don't want to deploy that. And if you do this review before you do the commit to staging, then the person who's doing the sync on the production environment has less to review when they're looking at all of the files that have been changed over there to make sure that everything is working. This is the kind of thing that I do all of the time, and it totally makes sense in my head. And I don't realize until I say it out loud how complicated it is. I'm like, oh, this is harder to say than I thought it would be. But yeah, I love working with configuration in files. It took some getting used to in the beginning. A bunch of people have different ways they like to manage it. I think Jeff has a different way he likes to manage it, and he wrote a blog post on how he does it. I don't remember his blog post URL, but it's in Gitter if you're interested in looking at that.
You tried to build any batch scripts to help this process?
I have not. I could imagine how they would be really helpful on an environment where you're always doing the same thing over and over again, like on the live site, like even having a Josh command that would be like config stage or something, and it would always make that copy would be good. With the stuff that I'm changing, I'd like to be able to review each thing individually. And so I've just been doing it manually because I'm like, oh, what's in here? Oh, what's in here? What's in here? And then that way I'm like thinking about it the whole time. But I think maybe in a year, once I feel like I don't need to watch everything, then I'll be like, okay, now I know what I do every time, and I'd be able to script it.
We use some things with Drupal 8 now. We use Doxel. So we have built some commands that allow you to do the review stuff, but they do all the rote steps that you have to go through. You have to pull the live database, you have to run configuration import, you have to run cache clear, you have to run up a DB, right? So we just have fin sync. Just goes out there and does all that stuff, and then you're ready, and now you can review, see what is uncommitted there. It's like, oh, okay,
yeah.
Now I have to know what to do with this. Why is this here?
I could see how that would be really helpful, especially on something like backdropcms.org that has a bunch of people working on it, but nobody's working on it all the time. So when you do go to touch it, it's been a really long time since you worked on it last. Having something that would be a command that would be like, pull down the latest files, pull down the database, sync your config with the latest database behavior, just to get to like a starting point, and then be like, okay, here's a clean starting position, go. And then when you're done, if you wanted to do the manual review, you could, but you could also just be like, make it ready to deploy. And it could even do like a comparison with like pulling down from live, making sure nothing's changed that you also changed, and then like throw an error and be like, you both have modified X view or whatever it is. But yeah, I could see how that would be really helpful. And for something like this, where we have sanitized database backups for everyone who's working on Backdrop sites, you could even have it like copy a new version of the database on that initial one, where it would be like, hey, we know where this file lives, we know how to get it, we'll just include it in this command, and that way you can like run it locally and it'll go and do all the stuff it's supposed to do. Yeah, that'd be cool.
We have some of our commands that it'll create a database on hand. We'll download that copy of that database, load it on your machine. So it's just like prepare, right? Get everything and bring it down.
Yeah.
And it just copy and make sure and you're not going to be.
Yeah.
That's really the. We haven't talked about much here, but what we get with these virtualization containerized approaches like Doxel, I know, is that you can create workflows that are exactly the same for everyone. And the commands are right in there, right? With and then you have a readme in the file, and it's like, this is how you work with our workflow on the site.
Yeah. Yeah.
Run these commands.
Yeah. That's why I ended up creating these readmes, was actually because we originally started with Figure 8 and people are like, this is really confusing. And I'm like, well, I'm going to change it. But if I'm going to change it, anyone who's worked on it a month ago is going to be really lost when they come back and it's different now. So I wrote it all down and I'm like, okay, better document it. But hopefully we can keep this up to date when we change it again next time. But yeah, having it built into Dresh, I think could be really helpful, where like if there were backdropcms.org helper commands in Drush, we might get a whole bunch more contributors to backdropcms.org. They'd be like, oh, I want to fix that, and I can just run this command, and I can have access to the code base, so I can do whatever. That would be really cool. Also potentially really dangerous, but really cool.
I've been doing some other business in Atlas, and I think that what I'm hearing you say, and I've heard other people, I mean, first of all, I'm just going to say, we had a virtual user group meeting. We talked about there's a number of regular backdrop users that are still struggling a bit with how to best work this into our workflow. So coming up with good best practices is really helpful. An experience, and that will be great. Get something that works great for you, share it. The Figure 8 thing, I think you said, is working good as a team. It starts to run problems, but I was concerned about. I just want to say this out loud and see if it makes sense. I think the great Jeff's basic premise as well. I mean, part of the premise is you're pushing config to production, right? Data. It's just it isn't that clean, is it? Part of the problem is you can't intersect it.
Yeah, and I think that's also some of the Pantheon folks, their resistance to having anything be web writable other than the files directory is that nothing should ever change in production. And I feel like that makes sense if you have an active development team who can support every change that needs to be made by doing a configuration and a deploy. But our audience is not the kind of people that have an active development team that can support every change that needs to be made. And that's why Backdrop has user interfaces, right? It has this administrative tool that's really powerful and lets you do anything like make configuration changes. And I think it's just not a good match to have your environment be so locked down that you can't ever make a change in production, to a software tool that's intended to let anybody make any change they need in production. But yeah, I mean, I understand it's a best practice, but I feel like that's not the world we're living in. We're living in the world with like WordPress developers who manage files via FTP and have never used Git, right? So I think that those are the people we're after. We're not going to say you can't make any configuration changes in production.
So what I think Jeff's proposal is, it seemed to make sense to me, maybe slightly like that you have your Active Directory that's excluded from Git altogether, right? You're tracking it. Then you have a version copy, and you are linking in your settings.php, your staging to that version.
Yep.
So at any time, anybody can commit like a new set of config, right, locally. They can push it out. If they're conflicting with somebody else, they specification, do a diff and sort that out.
Yep.
Once they push it up, then they can just use the interface to do an import.
Yep.
It's going to look at that version, compare that to the live.
Yeah.
So does that seem like that sort of a...
So that's very similar to this workflow. The only difference with the one that you're describing is that nobody would be able to get any changes to what's happening in production in Jeff's workflow.
So what I think I would do would be just export it manually and commit it locally.
Yeah.
So I could get it, but I would get it not from the server.
Right.
But I would get it.
That would work too. I really like having it in version control though. There's just something that I find a lot more comforting about knowing that it's always in version control rather than like only the times that anyone exports it, it ends up in version control. I think part of it is because of my paranoia about the WordPress hack where you can just log into the server and see what's been changed. Being able to do that on a production environment gives me some confidence where I'm like, I know the only thing that's changed is this one line in the system core file and I can handle that. But yeah, I also, with my experience on Pantheon, like not having the production copy and version control makes me a little nervous. So I'm like, what happens if you lose it? Because now there's nothing there for you to export because it's gone. So yeah, and you know, with files directory, you can do stuff like move it around, wiggledy-piggledy on Pantheon. And so having something somewhere that I know is safe, that and up to date is good.
Anytime you change it to commit them, it's not all bad.
Yeah. But I think that the point that Jeff and I are agreeing on here is that if you commit only to staging, it makes everybody who's running a copy of the site, whether it's production or anyone else who's running it or on a beta server or whatever, can have the ability to run the sync and get up to date. And I think that that's really valuable. And that's probably the most important part of it, is having the staging part and version control. And that's what the folks at Pantheon also recommended us to do. They're like, you can pull the staging directory out of the files directory and commit that. And you can use that for the deployment workflow because, you know, Pantheon or Backup will read from that files directory. It can't delete them because it can't write them, but it's fine because I always check out that directory again anyway and leave the files in there. Backup doesn't care if there's files in there or not. So if Pantheon can't delete them, that doesn't matter. It still works just fine. So it's the same kind of root thing. It's like always have everything in staging up to date, and then anyone who's working on it can use staging to sync their local.
Late in the day.
Yeah, we originally had it earlier in the schedule, but then we had to move everything around. I was like, I'm not sure I want to do this at nap time, but yeah, I've also had people who have come to Drupal 7 from Backdrop and not even thought about configuration. Just use Drupal, use Backdrop the same way they use Drupal. And just been like, I'll just save the forms and do the things and export the database. And as long as every time you export the database, you bring the config files with you as though it was part of the database, that also works. So if configuration management is scary and not exciting, you can kind of ignore it and it'll do what it's supposed to do.
So this might be worth mentioning, and I think we alluded to it earlier because the problem I run into when I'm working in Drupal 8 and Backdrop, both of which have config management, right? But in Drupal, it's keeping a copy of the config in the database. And if I'm working alone, what I found is that with Drupal 8, what I tend to do is ignore config management and just sync my database and assume that I'm getting all of my config. And I have gotten into the problem where then I do that in Backdrop and things aren't working. And then I realized, well, it's because that config is not in the database. It's in those files. And if I don't actually physically move those files, I'm not moving the feature.
Yeah, that is something I didn't mention, is that anytime you do a database dump or import, whether it's when you're first starting or if it's been a couple months and you're starting over, you want to get both the database and the config live directory or wherever the live big files are stored, whether you have to do a virtual or user interface export or what have you. And those both import together. So if you're going to import the database, you need to also make sure you copy the files into your Active Directory of whatever site you're working on. Because the database will include like field tables, and your field tables are defined in the config files. And so if you have one and not the other, it's going to be a problem. Any other questions? see. What else are we supposed to be doing today?
Let's look at keys.
Oh, yeah. A break. We just had a break. Show and tell. Do we want to do, Tim, I know you had a thing we skipped earlier on participation in the Backdrop community. Do you want to save that till the end of the day?
I think I would do those two things afterwards. If we're gonna do the show and tell, we do it as well.
Okay. Well, I'm going to try and figure out how to stop these recordings. This one's
I mean,
easy.
Again, I think